Hey guys, this is Ryan. Welcome back to Unit 2. Congrats on making it through the foundations of U.S. government. Moving on to the beginnings of the three branches. In Unit 2, we're going to talk about the legislative and the executive branch. These two branches come first, and then in Unit 3, we'll look deeply at the judicial branch and the civil rights, as well as civil liberties. So, our statement of inquiry for Unit 2 is independence keeps power in check. I chose this statement of inquiry because I wanted our scholars to explore the ways in which their own power and independence influence their elected officials. The key concept that I chose was systems, because the government's just one big system that relies on other people and components in order to improve the environment around it. During Unit 2, we'll explore ideas that impact our elected officials and our own power within the government. Scholars might even find out that their personal influence may not be as influential as they previously thought. Scholars will explore gerrymandering and lobbying, while also delving into how their own voice can impact their elected officials. Scholars will continue to explore their own voice within the government system during Unit 3 on the civil rights and the civil liberties. The first debatable question I chose for Unit 2: does interdependence provide for progress, or does it hinder progress? I chose this question to allow scholars to explore their interdependence with the rest of the citizens of the United States. Scholars should understand that making a difference in the world is far from a one-person job. It takes huge groups of people who share a vision and have a manageable plan to help progress society forward. The second question, who has more power, Congress or the President, and who should have more power, is a question I want scholars to struggle with throughout the unit. I want to ask this question several times from the first day of Unit 2 all the way through to the performance task. Let's take a look at the assessment portion. I did not write a traditional multiple choice or free response test for Unit 2 because scholars will be taking the Quarter 1 CA at the end of this unit anyway. Instead, I constructed a performance task that asked scholars to make a choice and support their answer to that debatable question. Scholars are going to write their own opinion paper that explains who scholars believe is more powerful, Congress or the President. The paper I expect my Hampton scholars to write should be 3 to 4 pages long, and they need to cite several sources throughout the paper. This is the first major assessment that will begin to allow scholars to test some of the skills that we want our scholars to use on their historical investigation during the second semester. Make sure that scholars are well versed in OPVL, since they will need to use that strategy several times throughout their opinion papers. I've built in at least 2 chances for scholars to use and practice OPVL, but feel free to move these around as you see fit. Just don't get bogged down during this unit. Unit 1 and 2 are very fast, and the Humanities CA is usually one of the first to be tested, so make sure you cover all of the lessons before the CA window starts. I recommend having their performance task due after the CAs, so scholars aren't hyper-focused on one over the other. Let's talk about some of the lessons and outputs I plan to get from my scholars. The first one you're going to see here is the government cheat sheet. This is linked in Blackboard under the Resources tab. This cheat sheet has all of the most important yet basic information scholars need to know to be very successful in the class. Some of it should already be familiar to them, like the constitutional principles and federalism, but everything else is going to be taught over the next 2 units. If scholars know these details before they get to the lessons about these particular topics, it helps them make sense and fit it all together. I like to give this full cheat sheet to my scholars and give them a week or 2 to memorize as much as they can, and then give them a blank one like this to fill out on their own. It is not the most IB assessment out there, but if they take it seriously, it really helps them sort out the blurry details for themselves and make connections that it's hard for them to make on their own in class. The first lesson of Unit 2 sets up the structure of the legislative branch and the way Congress members gain their membership. One of my favorite things to let scholars do is visit the redistrictinggame.com and have them explore and investigate redistricting and gerrymandering on their own. The site is pretty user-friendly, but I definitely recommend checking this out beforehand so you're available to help scholars navigate and play the game without wasting too much time. The second lesson explores how checks and balances affects the lawmaking process. My scholars love to make these board games that explore the bill to law process. I like this board game in particular because it's more than just a flowchart of the process. It shows the ins and outs of the process while also constructing the entire game board in the shape of the Capitol to remind us where the entire process is taking place. This is another example of the board game. I know it looks more simplified than the first one, but I really like this one because of the rainbow and graveyard that reminds us that the process can be messy and not all bills make it through. The ladders also remind us that just because you're making progress doesn't mean you won't have to backtrack and redo parts of the process. These board games are an excellent example of the Avid style one-pagers that my scholars work on a lot in class. Avid style one-pagers give scholars an opportunity to be creative while also explaining in various ways how they understand a major topic. When we move on to the executive branch, I like to spend the majority of class time exploring the extensive bureaucracy because this is where a lot of the power of the executive branch lies, and it's also a pretty hard concept for scholars to understand. Make sure you take time to explore the 4 types of bureaucratic agencies and some examples of each, because it makes up a decent portion of the CA. These are the types of bureaucratic agencies. The most familiar are the cabinet departments, the people directly underneath the president. But the other bureaucratic agencies are independent executive agencies, those created to do a specific task, like NASA, whose charge is to explore space. The independent regulatory commissions, who handle most things having to do with the money and the economy in the United States. The last type are government corporations. These are companies owned by the government, but they can create a profit, like the U.S. Postal Service. Speaking of the CA, this is the ultimate assessment of Unit 2 and the first quarter in general. Make sure you've taught all of your Unit 1 and 2 lessons by the beginning of the CA window. Namisha and I have talked about your concerns with the CA, and she took many of our suggestions to heart and made several of the changes that we asked for. Be sure to take a look at the revised CA to know exactly which changes have been made, and remember that most of them were pretty minor changes like Tier 2 vocabulary and Tier 3 vocabulary we thought our scholars may not know yet. Don't forget that you need to norm on your CA grading as well, so that we all do this the same way. The norming documents will be up a couple of weeks before the CA window opens. That's all I have for Unit 2. Remember to email me if you have any questions about the units or how to structure a particular lesson. I'll see you all at our Uplift-wide mandatory monthly roundtable. Be on the lookout for an email to vote on the topic you want me to prepare. And don't forget to bring your own questions about the content. See y'all later.